Hey guys, this is Carl with the Peterborough Axe Club, and I'm here to introduce a new style of axe throwing play for the IATF world. Now, technically it's not a new style, it can be considered an addition onto the classic IATF style of gameplay. So, someone can still play the regular IATF style of gameplay, this is good especially for beginners who are just learning how to play, just trying to stick their hatchets in the beginning, trying to get more and more accurate and precise, learn clutch, learn big axe, all that kind of stuff. But along the way, they can now go a little bit further. And this is really important for all those veterans that are very good at axe throwing. Because in the classic IATF style of axe throwing, it's very linear. I'm throwing on my boards, you're throwing on your boards, and as long as I'm slightly more precise than you, I'm going to win, right? Not with this PAX style of axe throwing gameplay. Instead, what happens is there are options, and you can select those options really at any point in the gameplay. Now, gameplay becomes dynamic because I'm no longer just playing my boards, I'm playing my opponent. And what I mean by that is this. In this style of gameplay, I can attack my opponent, and my opponent must defend. And I'm not simply trying to go up in points, I will be drawing them down in their points. That's right. I can attack you, and you must defend or you lose points. So instead of me simply hitting bullseyes and you hitting bullseyes, and we always go up, but nobody's really advancing above the other person, I can pull you down and advance by proxy of the difference of our points. This is weird, right? But it's incredibly interesting. So in this tutorial, I'm going to go over the rules of gameplay, when an attack can be initiated, how defenses are done, and what a failed attack would look like. All right, so the video you're about to watch is going to give you the nuts and bolts of all the rules for this style of gameplay. But before we get into that, I just want to take a brief moment to give you a little bit of context behind this so that you understand the rules as they're presented to you. There's just a few things that if you remember them, everything else will fall into place. So first off, you always have a first throwing player and a second throwing player. So at no point do both players throw at the same time. Next, gameplay functions normally as per typical IATF style of gameplay until someone decides to attack their opponent. Number 3, attacks serve not to advance your own score, but to subtract a score from your opponent. So again, they don't advance your own score, rather, they subtract points from your opponent. And how do attacks work? There are 3 basic outcomes to an attack. The first is that you decide to attack your opponent, but you failed in hitting your target, hitting what you intended on. And therefore, that's a failed attempt. In such a case, you'll receive a score of 0, and your opponent, well, they'll just receive their normal score for that frame. The second thing that could happen is that you hit your intended target, but they also reciprocated by hitting their intended target, and therefore they had a successful defense. In such a case, both you and your opponent receive a score of 0, that frame is a wash, and you'll move on to the next frame. The third thing that could happen is that you hit your intended target, your attack was a success, but they failed in hitting theirs, in which their defense was a failure. In such a case, you will receive a score of 0, but they will go down in their points. So they will have a score detracted from the score of that game. Now, there are some nuanced rules pertaining to fifth and final throw, but we'll get into that in the video, so you don't need to worry about that right now. As for now, enjoy the video, and we'll see you at the end of it.
So what I want you to remember as we explain the rules is that other than just throwing for points, a player can attack or defend. There are 3 possible outcomes. An attack may fail outright, it may land but the other player defends, or it landed and the defense failed. Okay, got it? Great. Let's get into the rules. Rules. I will go over some of the basic rules for gameplay. The full set of rules, as well as the game sheets, can be downloaded from the Peterborough Axe Club website. Link in the description. Opening the match. Players will play rock, paper, scissors, and the winner determines if they want to choose the boards that they will start on, or if they want the choice of selecting whether they are the first throwing or the second throwing player in the opening game. They will alternate being the first throwing player and second throwing player in each subsequent game in the same way that players switch sides on each subsequent game. Here, let's say that Dave won the rock, paper, scissors and has chosen which boards he wants to start on. Therefore, Mary gets to choose if she wants to be the first throwing player or the second throwing player. She chooses to be the second throwing player. We fill in this box to show that Dave is the first throwing player for the first game. In this tutorial, we'll be referring to Dave as the first throwing player and Mary as the second throwing player, since their throwing position is more important than their names, since it will affect how attacks and defenses work. Now, the game can begin. Gameplay for the first 4 frames of the game. The 2 players can throw for points as they alternate between their turns throwing. The first throwing player always throws first. Scores are recorded. However, in any frame, either the first throwing player or second throwing player can throw for one of 4 grimaces on their turn. Throwing for grimace is an attack on their opponent. If hit, the defending player must throw at that same corresponding grimace. The intention to throw for grimace must be called out before throwing. If grimace is called in a particular frame, their opponents cannot also call grimace in that frame. Each of the players can call grimace up to 3 times in a particular match. Score sheets. Let's take a quick look at the score sheets so you can understand how scoring takes place. Here's where the players' names go. Here is where you indicate who the starting first throwing player is. That way we can keep track throughout the games. Here is where the normal scores get recorded. And here is the total of the scores from the 5 frames of the game. This first box corresponding to this frame indicates that a player has called grimace. Place a dot here. If the player successfully hits grimace, then place a second dot in the second box beside it. If that player misses, then put a slash. If the attacking player successfully hits grimace, then the defending player must also hit grimace as a defense. Place a dot indicating a hit or a slash indicating a miss in the second box corresponding to the defending player's frame. There's a bit more on how to fill the score sheets for a frame, but we'll get into that in a bit. For now, let's get back to gameplay. Gameplay for the first 4 frames of a game continued. So let's say that the first throwing player wanted to throw for grimace as an attack on the second throwing player. The first throwing player would call out that they are throwing for grimace. The scorekeeper puts a dot in the first box corresponding to this player's current frame. The first throwing player now throws. Here we have a number of potential outcomes. 1. The first throwing player misses grimace. If the first throwing player misses grimace, the scorekeeper puts a slash in the second box corresponding to this player's frame. The first throwing player receives a score of 0 in that frame. The second throwing player now throws for points, and those points are recorded. 2. The first throwing player and second throwing player both hit grimace. If the first throwing player hits grimace, the scorekeeper puts a dot in the second box corresponding to the frame. Now, the second throwing player has a chance to throw for grimace as a defense. If the second throwing player hits grimace, then the defense was successful. The scorekeeper puts a dot in this player's second box corresponding to this player's frame. Both the first throwing player and second throwing player receive a score of 0 for this frame. The second throwing player cannot throw for grimace at this time. 3. The first throwing player hits grimace and the second throwing player misses grimace. If the second throwing player misses Grimace, the scorekeeper would put a slash in the box of the second throwing player. Now, the first throwing player throws again to determine how many points the second throwing player goes down by. For example, if the first throwing player hits a bullseye, then the second throwing player would receive a score of -5 in that frame. The first throwing player would receive a score of 0 in that frame. Remember, the purpose of an attack is not to advance one's own score, but to diminish the opponent's score. Now let's move on to the next frame. Here, let's say that the second throwing player wants to throw for Grimace as an attack on the first throwing player. The first throwing player would have thrown for points already. The second throwing player calls out that she wants to throw for Grimace, and so the scorekeeper puts a dot in the second throwing player's first box corresponding to this frame, indicating that they are throwing for Grimace. The outcomes work as follows. 1. The second throwing player misses Grimace. If the second throwing player misses Grimace, the scorekeeper will put a slash in the second box here. Here, the first throwing player keeps the recorded score thrown in the current frame, while the second throwing player receives a score of 0. 2. The second throwing player and first throwing player both hit Grimace. If the second throwing player hits Grimace, the scorekeeper will put a dot in the second box. The first throwing player now has a chance to throw for Grimace as a defense. If the first throwing player hits Grimace and successfully defends, the scorekeeper will put a dot in the second box for the first throwing player's frame. Both the first throwing player and second throwing player receive a score of 0. These two scenarios are just like what would happen if the first throwing player had initiated an attack. However, the third scenario is where things change up a little. 3. The second throwing player hits and the first throwing player misses. If the first throwing player misses Grimace and fails to defend, the scorekeeper puts a slash in the second box, and the points that the first throwing player had thrown in the current frame is now scored as a negative of that numerical value. For example, if the first throwing player hits a 3 and fails to defend when the second throwing player hits Grimace, then the first throwing player's 3 is now marked down as a -3. The second throwing player receives a score of 0 for this frame. The advantage for the second throwing player is the numerical score detracted from the first throwing player. Here, the second throwing player has a slight advantage since, if the first throwing player threw a 3, the second throwing player can wait until a later frame when the first throwing player hits a higher point value to take full advantage of the score. Ultimately, the second throwing player gets to play position. Final throw. Whoever has the most points going into the 5th frame throws first. That person is now the first throwing player, even if they were the second throwing player in the previous 4 frames. For example, let's say that Mary is up by 3 going into the final frame. Although she was the second throwing player up to this point, because she is leading in points, she will be the first throwing player for the 5th frame. The first throwing player can throw for points, clutch, or Grimace. The scorekeeper must be notified in advance of what the first throwing player will be throwing for. Here, the scenarios are as follows. 1. The first throwing player misses Grimace. If the first throwing player misses Grimace, the scorekeeper records the intent and the miss. The first throwing player would receive a score of 0 for this frame. The second throwing player now throws for points, and those points are recorded. Clutch is an option for the second throwing player in this throw. 2. If the first throwing player and second throwing player both hit Grimace. In such a case where the defense was successful, things will function a little differently than normally for this kind of scenario. Normally, the second throwing player's successful defense would mean that both players receive a score of 0. However, since this is the final throw, that would mean an automatic loss for the second throwing player, given that the first throwing player has a tactical advantage since they are in the lead. Potentially, a first throwing player would always call for Grimace as a play to stall the points as they are. To avoid this, in the fifth and final frame, if the second throwing player successfully defends, then the first throwing player gets the score of 0 for a failed attack, and the second throwing player will throw for points or clutch, but not Grimace. 3. The first throwing player hits, and the second throwing player misses Grimace. If the second throwing player misses Grimace, the scorekeeper records the miss. Then, the first throwing player throws again to determine how many points the second throwing player goes down by. The first throwing player would be awarded a score of 0 for this frame. Okay, let's back up and assume that the first throwing player threw for either points or clutch, but not Grimace. It is now the second throwing player's turn, who can now throw for points, clutch, or Grimace. The scorekeeper must be notified in advance of what the second throwing player will be throwing for. If the second throwing player decides to throw for Grimace, the scenario would be as follows. 1. The second throwing player misses Grimace. If the second throwing player misses Grimace, then the first throwing player keeps his or her recorded score, and the second throwing player receives a score of 0. The first throwing player will have secured a win for the game. 2. The second throwing player and first throwing player both hit Grimace. If the second throwing player hits Grimace, then the first throwing player has a chance to throw for Grimace as a defense. If the first throwing player hits Grimace and successfully defends, then both the first throwing player and second throwing player receive a score of 0, and the first throwing player will have secured a win for the game. 3. The second throwing player hits Grimace, but the first throwing player misses. If the first throwing player misses Grimace and fails to defend, then the points that the first throwing player had thrown in the current frame is now scored as a negative of that numerical value, working against the first throwing player's total score for the round. The second throwing player receives a score of 0 for this final frame. Again, here, the advantage for the second throwing player is the numerical score detracted from the first throwing player. Note, throwing for Grimace in the fifth frame is riskier than in the previous 4 frames. In the previous frames, there is a chance to win, a chance to lose, and a chance for the frame to be a wash. However, in the fifth frame, both the first throwing player and second throwing player have 2 chances at a loss and only 1 for a win. Final throw in a tie situation. Players may decide together in advance if they want to throw for points, clutch, or Grimace. Or the player with the least number of game wins can choose to defer his or her choice of what to throw for until after the opponent's final throw. Once the decision has been made by each player, the decisions cannot be rescinded. When throwing in the fifth frame, after being tied at the end of the 4 previous frames, a Grimace is worth 9 points and does not lead to an attack or defense play as it normally would. If throwing for Grimace, each player may decide for themselves which Grimace they wish to shoot for. Big Axe. Big Axe will result when the final number of game wins after all completed games of a single match result in no one player having more game wins than another. The 2 throwers will play rock, paper, scissors, and the winner determines who throws first. Each player throws an equal amount of Big Axe throws, ending when one player has a point advantage after all allotted throws. Points equal 1, 3, and 5 points respectively. Clutches and Grimaces are 7 and 9 points respectively. Hitting a bullseye opens both clutches as well as Grimaces. If throwing for Grimace, each player may decide for themselves which Grimace they wish to shoot for. Grimaces do not initiate an attack or form a defense.
All right, there you have it. Hopefully you find it as exciting as we do. We are going to make everything available through the Peterborough Axe Club website. So go to ptboaxe.com, and what you will find there is all the rules, the score sheets that can be downloaded, as well as the dimensions for the new Grimace card and how to use it. In addition to that, we are going to make available a sort of board game version. Basically, it's a version of axe throwing that you can play rolling 2 dice. And there will be a sheet that will help you understand how the numerical value on the dice correlates to the probability of you hitting a particular point set or grimace or clutch on the targets. This will allow you to sit with a friend and, by rolling dice, play out this game set, make your choices, make your decisions, figure out when's a good time to attack, if a defense was successful, so on and so forth, as well as learn how to fill out the score sheet. So this is a way that you can practice this style of game throw without leaving the comfort of your home. There you go. All right, guys, so let's get into it. Let's get out there, let's throw, let's have some fun, let's explore this new style, and as always, we welcome your feedback and any interesting scenarios that emerge through this style of gameplay. Guys, all the best, and we'll see you out there in the axe throwing world.